The rain had started at dawn, tapping gently on the wide windows of the Berkshire Hathaway building in Omaha. The city, still heavy with the mist of early spring, moved slowly. Streetlights blinked above wet asphalt. In the corner office on the 14th floor, nothing overly grand, just quiet and neatly organized. Warren Buffett sat at his desk, fingers resting lightly on a worn yellow notepad. He wasn't reading, nor writing, just listening. The kind of listening that comes after a long life of hearing. The kind of stillness that belongs to a man who has nothing left to prove. The office was silent, except for the soft hum of the radiator and the rhythmic clicking of a wall clock. A gift from a friend long past. On a nearby shelf, a single framed photo. 3 children playing on a beach, their faces turned to the sun. No nameplate on the door, no golden plaques, just the faint scent of paper, dust, and memory. That morning, Warren had made an uncharacteristic request. He had asked for a new janitor. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. The company's regular cleaning staff had been reassigned due to maintenance schedules. A temporary replacement would suffice. Yet, as always with Warren, even the quietest decisions had echoes, and so arrived Eli. 58 years old. Thin, frame, a limp in his right leg from a fall 2 decades ago, calloused hands, weathered face. He carried with him a small black lunchbox, a cloth towel, and a folded piece of paper, a prayer scribbled by his granddaughter. He entered the building without fanfare, invisible to most, to everyone but Warren. From his window, Warren watched as Eli stepped into the lobby, hesitated, then asked the receptionist for directions. The old man's eyes narrowed, not in scrutiny, but in something closer to remembrance. It was just a janitor, just a man with a mop and a cart. But Warren had learned, truly learned, that those who walk the quietest roads often carry the heaviest stories. When Eli entered the office later that afternoon, Warren didn't greet him. He simply looked up, met the man's gaze for a moment, and returned to his reading. No words, just that shared silence, respectful, mutual. Eli worked methodically. He dusted the shelves, wiped the windows, careful not to disturb anything. Then he turned to the small bin beside the desk, a metal trash can lined with thin plastic. He paused. Inside was nothing remarkable at first glance. A crumpled sandwich wrapper, the torn corner of a newspaper, an envelope unopened, and a yellow note half torn, almost illegible. It was the note that caught his eye. Folded once, the paper felt heavier than it should. There was something almost reverent in how it had been discarded, as if thrown away, not in anger, but in quiet sorrow. Eli glanced at the door, still ajar. Warren hadn't moved. He turned the paper over. 4 words, written in faded ink. Find the boy again. No name, no context, just a quiet command or perhaps a plea lost to the bottom of a bin. Eli didn't know why it hit him so hard. Maybe it was the way it had been folded. Maybe it was the handwriting, shaking slightly yet deliberate. Or maybe it was the way he recognized the kind of grief that doesn't scream, the kind that whispers. He placed the note gently back in the trash, wiped the edges of the bin, and stood still for a long time, mop in hand. Behind him, Warren spoke without lifting his eyes. Strange, isn't it, he said softly, how some things only become heavy once you try to throw them away. Eli didn't answer, didn't need to. The room had already become a different place. Eli finished his cleaning in silence that afternoon. Each corner he wiped seemed to echo the presence of that note. Find the boy again. The words clung to him like dust he couldn't sweep away. And Warren? He never looked up again. Just sat, motionless, the way some people do when the past decides to pay a quiet visit. That night, Eli lay in his small apartment 2 bus stops from the city's edge, the note echoing in his thoughts. He had seen grief before, in hospital waiting rooms, at military funerals, in his own mirror after his brother's accident. But this grief was different. It had edges, and it had weight. He thought of asking about it. But janitors don't ask questions. They collect things. They discard things. They witness. The next day, Warren's office was just as quiet. The same rain-patterned windows, the same desk, the same clock. But the trash can was empty, except for a photograph, old, frayed at the corners. 2 boys, one with glasses, the other holding a kite, standing on what looked like a rural road, wide fields stretching behind them. Eli didn't touch it, just stared, then cleaned around it. On the 3rd day, a letter appeared in the trash, unopened. The envelope bore no return address, just a single name, Henry. Eli began to understand, or at least feel, that this was no ordinary waste bin. It was becoming something else, a confession box, a silent journal, a place where memory was laid down to be forgotten, but maybe hope to be found. By the 4th day, Warren spoke again. Not much, just 3 sentences. You ever lose someone before you knew how much they mattered? Funny how absence shapes you more than presence. I used to think numbers told the whole story. Eli didn't answer, but he nodded, slowly. And in that moment, something shifted. Because in the janitor's silence, Warren found space. And in Warren's quiet unraveling, Eli found pieces of himself he thought were long swept away. Each day after, Warren seemed a little more distant, not confused, not forgetful, but deep inside something, somewhere older, somewhere buried. And each day the trash revealed a new artifact. A child's drawing of a treehouse, a folded church bulletin from 1962, a used movie ticket stained and fading, a chess pawn cracked at the base. Eli started collecting them, not out of curiosity but out of reverence. He brought a small box from home, the kind that once held tools, and began placing the items carefully inside. Not stealing, preserving, because some things, even when discarded, aren't meant to disappear. One evening, Warren stood as Eli entered. His hands were behind his back and his voice was soft. "Eli," he said, as if trying the name for the first time. "I was 9 when I met him. The boy in the picture." He didn't elaborate, just turned to the window, watching the dusk crawl over the city. That night, Eli didn't sleep. He kept the box beside his bed, lid open, the photo, the note, the pawn, all arranged like clues. He wasn't sure what he was trying to solve, but something told him, quietly, like a whisper between the cracks, that Warren wasn't just cleaning out an office. He was preparing to leave something behind, something he couldn't carry with him, and perhaps in the way only time can orchestrate, it had found the right hands. The 5th day, it snowed lightly in Omaha. Not enough to blanket the streets, just enough to soften the edges of everything. Eli arrived early, the first footprints on the thin frost leading to the back entrance of the building. He wore an old wool coat and carried, as always, his lunchbox and the small black box, now filled with fragments of Warren's discarded past. That morning, the office was different, dimmer somehow. A single lamp lit Warren's desk, casting a warm pool of light on the leather blotter. Warren wasn't reading or writing. He was staring at something in his hand, something small, metallic. When Eli entered, Warren held it out silently. "A key." "To the cabinet in the back," he said. "You'll find the rest there." Eli didn't ask. He took the key and crossed the room to the wooden cabinet Warren had never touched in his presence. The lock clicked open with a tired sigh. Inside were boxes, not files, not business documents, but shoeboxes, cigar tins, and envelopes tied with a twine. Warren remained seated, not looking at Eli, only speaking as if to the air between them. "I met Henry when I was a child. He lived 3 houses down. My father didn't think much of him, said he was too wild, too curious. Eli sat on the floor, lifting one of the boxes. Inside were marbles, a faded toy truck, and a pressed flower between two index cards. He'd taught me how to build a kite from newspaper and string, said flying was a way to remember we weren't made for walls. Warren's voice didn't tremble. It didn't need to. The emotion was in the cadence, in the pauses, in the way he avoided. Looking at the cabinet, one day he just stopped showing up. I waited, a week, a month. Then I heard from my mother he'd been sent away to live with an uncle. Some family trouble. I never saw him again. Eli found an envelope among the boxes. Inside, a letter never sent. The name on it, Henry, written in a teenager's careful scrawl. I wrote him once, Warren said, poured everything into that letter, every question I never got to ask, every apology I never made. But I didn't send it. I was afraid it was too late, that he wouldn't remember me. He smiled faintly, almost apologetically. Isn't it strange, all the things we throw away, not because they're trash, but because we're scared they still matter? Eli nodded, still kneeling by the cabinet, holding the letter as if it were glass. For the next hour they sat, one by the desk, the other by the past, in a silence thick with memory. And slowly, Warren began to speak, not all at once, not like a flood, but like autumn leaves falling, one by one, gentle and true. He spoke of the field where they once buried a time capsule, of the promise they made to dig it up when they were 20, of how that age came and went with no reunion. He spoke of the day he read in a regional paper, decades later, a brief obituary. Henry Langston, 74, survived by no known family. A two-line goodbye for a boy who once built kites. That was the first time I questioned success, Warren said. Not the money, not the companies, but the way I measured worth. I had spent a lifetime investing in businesses, and somehow forgotten to invest in one of the few people who made me feel free. Eli listened, unmoving, not as a janitor, not even as a man, but as a witness. And that afternoon, as the snow melted into quiet puddles outside, something else melted too. The veneer, the weight, the invisible armor that Warren Buffett had worn not for the world, but for himself. I don't want to die full, he said, full of stories I never told, of people I never returned to, of apologies never spoken. Eli placed the letter back in the envelope, then into the black box. Some things deserved their own altar. And in that moment, without ever saying so, the roles had reversed. The janitor had become the keeper, and the billionaire, the one who needed to be held. The next week passed like a slow breath. Warren no longer filled his trash bin with ordinary waste. Instead, it became a place of release, a kind of sacred ground where the remnants of a life not quite reconciled were surrendered. Old receipts, with scribbled phone numbers, torn notebook pages with chess moves and annotations, a napkin with a poem, half-finished, written in ballpoint pen. Eli cleaned, but never discarded. Every fragment went into the black box. One morning, Warren left an old cassette on his desk, no label, just the faint sound of a recording when Eli pressed play in the janitor's closet after hours. A boy's voice, maybe 10 or 11, reading a list of things I'll do when I grow up. Be kind to people who are lonely. Buy a house with a swing. Write a book. Find Warren again. Eli sat on an overturned bucket, cassette turning in his hand, the sound fading into static. He didn't cry, but something tightened. In his chest, not pain exactly, but that deep ache that lives where forgotten dreams go. That night, he stayed late. He wrote a letter, not to Warren, but on behalf of him. A note to Henry. A letter never sent, never meant to be, but needed to exist. He folded it gently, placed it in the black box, and left the lid slightly open, as if to let the past breathe. The next day, Warren noticed, He walked slowly to the box, opened it, and took the letter out. He didn't read it at first, just held it. Then he looked at Eli, a question in his eyes. "You wrote this?" Eli nodded once. Warren didn't speak. He sat down at his desk, opened the letter, and read. And when he finished, he didn't fold it back. He placed it on the desk, flat, smoothed out the edges. "I wish someone had written that to me when I was young," he said. Then came something unexpected. He reached into his drawer and pulled out a folder. Inside were documents, old ones, deeds, trusts, and a handwritten list titled, "Legacy if no one remembers the numbers." He placed it before Eli. "I set this up a while ago," Warren said. "Not for headlines, not for institutions, just for someone who would understand the value of what gets thrown away." Eli looked down at the document, stunned. His name was there, a modest inheritance, not vast, but enough to change a life, enough to retire, enough to start something. "You've cleaned more than my office," Warren added. "You've made room for what I was afraid to look at." Eli couldn't find words, only breath, shaky, slow breath. Warren stood, walked to the window, and for the first time in days smiled. Not the practice smile of boardrooms and interviews, but something smaller, private, real. That afternoon, Eli didn't clean the office. Instead, he sat at Warren's invitation, and the two men played chess. No talking, just quiet strategy. A conversation made of pawns and rooks. The clock ticked, the light shifted, and in the silence between moves, a quiet kind of healing unfolded. Weeks passed, not marked by calendars, but by small rituals. Eli would arrive at sunrise, always with the same quiet steps, and Warren would be waiting, sometimes seated, sometimes standing by the window, watching the early light stretch over Omaha's rooftops like a blanket of second chances. They no longer spoke about the objects in the box. They didn't need to. Each item had already spoken its piece. Then one morning, Warren wasn't at his desk. The chair was empty. The lamp was off. The trash bin was untouched. Eli stood at the door for a moment longer than usual. Something in the air had shifted. Not tension. Something gentler. A kind of hush. On the desk lay a sealed envelope with his name, Eli. He opened it slowly, hands steady, but heart rising with the tremble of memory. The note inside was brief, typed, not handwritten. "If you're reading this, I'm probably not far. I've gone to find a kite. Thank you, not for cleaning, but for noticing what others overlook. The black box is yours now, not to keep, to pass on." There was no signature, no instructions, just a quiet transfer of something sacred. Eli sat in Warren's chair. It felt foreign at first, too large, too important, but then he realized Warren had never filled the chair with presence, only with listening. The black box was still in its usual place. He opened it. Inside, among the relics, was one final object, a folded paper kite, not fancy. Just newsprint and sticks. On one wing, faint pencil markings. "You remembered me." That afternoon, a call came. Warren had gone to the fields just outside town, a place not far from where he and Henry once played. A local farmer had found him seated on a bench near a windbreak of old trees, watching the sky, peaceful, still, gone. No spectacle, no farewell speech, no headlines, just gone. Eli attended the private service. Only a few were there, close staff, some family. He kept the kite in his coat, fingers wrapped around the spine like a tether to something ancient and pure. After the burial, he didn't speak to anyone. He walked, alone, to a small hill just beyond the cemetery, opened the black box, and laid each item on the grass. The photo, the pawn, the letter, the drawing, the cassette. Then he unfolded the kite. The wind was gentle, steady. He ran slowly at first, then faster, and the kite rose, clumsy at first, then sure, catching the air, lifting up, higher until it danced, alone, against a quiet blue sky. Eli stood there for a long time, watching, a man alone on a hill, but not lonely, not anymore, because in his silence he carried a life that had once been thrown away, and chosen to lift it back into the sky. 3 months had passed. Spring had returned to Omaha with its usual quiet bloom, magnolia trees opening like soft-lipped prayers, the Missouri River warming under longer days, and downtown settling into a gentler pace. The office Warren once occupied remained untouched for a while. No one rushed to clear it. Those who had known him seemed to instinctively understand that some spaces are not meant to be replaced, at least not immediately. But life moved forward, as it always does. And one morning, the door was opened for good. Not to erase, but to continue. Eli wasn't there that day. He had already stepped away from his janitorial duties. Officially, he had retired. Unofficially, he had begun walking a different path. He used part of what Warren had quietly left him to open a small reading room on the city's east side. It didn't look like much from the street, just a narrow brick building with a blue-painted door. But inside, it was something else entirely. Shelves lined the walls, filled with donated books, soft chairs, mismatched but welcoming. A kettle, always warm. A table near the window with a sign, "Stories left here are never thrown away." The black box sat on a pedestal in the back, surrounded by photographs, not of Warren, but of anonymous lives. Children playing, old men sitting, on porches, women laughing mid-sentence. Life as it is, not posed. People came and went. Some read, some cried, some sat in silence. No one was asked to explain why they came. And Eli, he was simply there, sweeping, serving tea, listening, always listening. One day, a boy came in, 10, maybe 11, wore his backpack like armor, said nothing, just browsed the shelves, stopped at the pedestal. "Who was he?" the boy asked, pointing to the box. Eli paused. "A man who built things no one saw," he said. The boy blinked. "Like what?" Eli smiled. "Like silence that heals, and questions that don't need answers." The boy didn't understand, but he didn't question it either. He stayed all afternoon. Later, Eli found a drawing left on the table, a picture of a kite high above a city skyline. In the corner, 2 stick figures, one old, one with a backpack. He added it to the wall. There were no grand tributes, no statues, no press releases, just a room where stories once discarded could find breath again, and a man who knew that what we keep and what we pass on defines the weight of our days. Eli never called it a legacy, but it was quiet, steady, inherited not through money, but through care. And every now and then, on a clear afternoon, he'd go to that same hill, unfold the same paper kite, and let it rise again. Not because it needed to, but because some memories deserved the sky. Eli aged quietly. Not the kind of aging that makes headlines, no sudden ailments, no great upheavals, just the steady passing of days, marked by tea stains on wooden counters and the soft creak of his chair by the window. He kept routines, lit the reading room's lamp each morning before the sun rose, fed the sparrows that gathered by the side of the building, read a page or two from whatever book he was dusting, and every so often he opened the black box, not to inspect, but simply to remember. One early evening, a woman visited, mid-30s, hair pulled back, tired eyes, hands that clutched a folder too tightly. She didn't say much, just asked if she could leave something with the others. Eli nodded, gesturing to the small altar where the box stood. She placed a photo, worn, folded, beside the box. A man and a little girl. Park bench, autumn leaves. She didn't explain, she didn't need to. As she left, she paused at the door. "Did he really work with Warren Buffett?" she asked, half smiling. Eli turned slowly. "No," he said. "He listened to him." She waited. "And sometimes," Eli added, "that's the more difficult job." The door closed softly behind her. That night, Eli wrote a note and added it to the box. He taught me that presence doesn't require speech, that absence doesn't erase love, that memory, like light, finds its way in through the quietest cracks. Over the years, the reading room's walls filled with stories, drawings, letters, newspaper clippings, napkins with poems, a collage of lives intertwined not by fame or fortune, but by the invisible thread of witness. Eli never became known. He didn't want to, but in libraries, school projects, and whispered family tales, people spoke of a place where stories go to be remembered, run by a quiet man who once flew a paper kite for someone no one else remembered. When Eli passed, it was in his sleep. He was found in his chair, a book resting open on his chest, a paper kite hanging from the ceiling above him, turning slowly in the ceiling fan's breeze. No one wept publicly, but for days after, strangers came. Some lit candles, some left items. A worn glove, a chess piece, a cassette. The reading room stayed open, now run by a former librarian who had once found a note inside a book that said, "Not everything forgotten is lost." The black box remained, but now beside it a plaque, not brass, not formal, just wood, hand-carved. For the ones who picked up what others threw away, for the ones who noticed, and high on the shelf, where sunlight could reach, the kite danced, still rising. Eli didn't seek followers. He wasn't building a movement, but quiet things tend to grow, and so did the room. One afternoon, a boy named Luis began showing up after school. 12 years old, wiry frame, eyes that darted like sparrows. He never spoke more than 5 words at a time, but he lingered, touching the books, tracing the corners of photos, staring often at the black box. Was that really his? He asked one day, pointing at the kite. Eli nodded. It flew higher than most. Luis looked up. Even if it was paper? Eli smiled, especially because it was paper. From then on, the boy returned every day, not to talk, but to be near, something he couldn't yet name. He helped rearrange the bookshelves, made tea, wrote little notes and left them between book pages. Sometimes he brought his sister, Lucia, who would read aloud softly in the corner. One day, Eli gave Luis a notebook. Empty, black cover, nothing written. For what? Luis asked. For the things you don't want to forget, Eli said. Luis opened to the first page and wrote slowly, Don't throw away people. He didn't know where it came from, but it felt true. Weeks passed, and the room changed with the children. More visitors arrived, a teacher who brought her class once a month, an old postman who started delivering not mail, but stories handwritten by neighbors, a widow who found the photo of Warren and Henry and wept without needing to explain. Eli became a quiet center in all of it, not directing, just holding, like a root system hidden underground, unseen, but feeding everything above. He began writing, more often. Letters never sent, names remembered, small memories, the weight of Warren's voice when he said, "Find the boy again." The silence after their first chess game, the way the light had touched Warren's desk that final morning. One letter stood out. Dear Warren, I think I understand now. You weren't looking for forgiveness. You were making space. For Henry, for me, for everyone who left something behind, afraid no one would care enough to notice. Thank you for trusting me to carry what you let go. I'm still learning to do it well. E. He placed the letter in the black box. That night, Luis found it. He didn't read it aloud, just sat beside the box and whispered, I'll keep learning too. That's how it began, the transmission. Not through inheritance, but imitation. Not in grandeur, but in quiet gestures like a boy walking a widow home, a girl pressing wildflowers between donated pages, a stranger returning a book with a note. I remembered something I thought I'd lost. Eli saw all of it, not as success, but as evidence that Warren's life hadn't ended with the kite. It had taken root, and now it was blooming, softly, silently, in lives he never met. Years passed like turning pages, slowly, with purpose. Eli's hair turned silver, his back curved slightly, but the light in his eyes remained steady. The reading room had changed, not in size but in presence. It had become part of the city's quiet heart, a place whispered about in hospital corridors, school assemblies, kitchen tables. People came not to escape, but to remember. One afternoon, Luis, now 16, approached Eli with a question. "Do you think Warren ever knew what he started?" Eli considered it. "I think he hoped, but he didn't need to know. Sometimes hope is enough." Luis nodded. Then he handed Eli a box, not black but deep blue, handcrafted from old oak. Inside were items carefully arranged. A photo of Eli holding the original black box, a drawing of the room with stick figure visitors, a recording of Luis reading his own letter. "I want this to continue," he said. Even when he didn't finish, he didn't have to. Eli placed a hand on the box and closed his eyes for a moment. "It already is." That night, Eli returned to the hill where he had once flown the paper kite. He brought with him a lantern, the black box, and Warren's photo. The stars were sharp in the sky, cold, clear, honest. He opened the box and slowly laid out each item again, as he had done years before. But this time, he spoke. To those who felt forgotten, to those who waited for a voice, to those who never received an answer. He paused, the wind brushing his cheek. "You were never alone." The next morning, Luis found a note taped to the reading room's door. "Gone for a walk. Back when the sky is done speaking." Eli returned 2 days later. No fanfare, just a little more silence in his step. After that, his visits to the room became less frequent. Luis, now confident, began hosting gatherings. Not readings exactly, more like quiet circles where people shared one memory each. Then passed a candle from hand to hand. The black box remained on its pedestal, untouched, sacred. One evening, a woman named Mara visited, middle-aged, voice like rain on glass. She had brought a suitcase filled with her father's journals. He had died months earlier, alone, estranged from his family. "I don't know why," she whispered, "but I felt like they belonged here." Luis opened the suitcase gently, paging through the lined notebooks. Each page was filled with a man's attempts to understand himself. They added them to the wall. Not edited, not framed, just present. That night, Mara stayed late. She made tea, she read aloud, she cried. No one tried to fix it, and something in her shifted. Outside, the city slept, but inside that modest room, something vast was quietly breathing. Legacy, not as inheritance, but as invitation. The reading room had grown into something it was never designed to be. Not a monument, not a museum, but a quiet exchange between generations. By the time Luis turned 23, he had made a habit of opening the door each morning before the sun rose, just as Eli once had. He brewed tea, dusted the shelves, and lit the small candle by the black box. Eli still came, but less often. He had taken to walking through neighborhoods with a small notebook in his coat pocket. Sometimes he wrote, sometimes he just observed. A girl waiting at a bus stop with a violin case. An older couple arguing gently over which brand of honey to buy. A teenage boy holding the hand of a younger sibling as they crossed a busy street. He collected these moments, not to share, not to publish, to preserve. One evening, after the last guest had left, Luis found Eli seated in the back of the room, staring at a single item on the floor. A frayed shoelace tied in a knot. "Someone left this on the bench," Eli said. Luis tilted his head. "Should I throw it out?" Eli shook his head. Sometimes the smallest things carry the deepest roots. He reached into his coat and pulled out his notebook, now full. Every page filled with scenes, none dramatic, none famous, just people noticing each other. He handed it to Luis. "This is yours now." Luis hesitated. "What do I do with it?" Eli smiled. "Add to it, or don't. Just carry it. Let it remind you that silence holds more stories than sound ever could." That night, Luis placed the notebook beside the black box. Then he added a single slip of paper, written in block letters. "What is left behind isn't gone, it's waiting." Months later, a quiet ceremony took place. No invitations, no photos. Just 12 people gathered in the field outside town, near the same hill where Warren's kite had flown. Luis stood holding the black box. Mara, the woman who had once left her father's journals, brought a candle. A former librarian read a poem she had found in the margin of a donated book. One by one, they spoke, but not about Warren or Eli. They spoke of themselves, of a moment they had been seen, of a word they had been given that made them stay, of an object, a letter, a stone, a napkin they had once nearly thrown away. Luis closed the ceremony with a simple gesture. He opened the box, took out the kite and held it to the sky. There was no wind, so he didn't try to fly it. He just stood there, arms raised, letting the stillness be enough. That was the legacy. Not noise, not names, but presence. And though the world outside moved fast, headlines, markets, noise, there in that field, time moved like breath. Slow, intentional, honest. When they returned to the city, Luis made a new sign for the front of the reading room. Handwritten, "You are seen, you are heard, even in your silence." And every morning as he unlocked the door, he whispered something Eli had once said, a line Luis had etched into memory, not because of its poetry, but because of its truth. Some people leave behind more by saying less. Years later, the reading room was still standing. The outside had changed. The paint faded, the bricks chipped by time. But inside, the silence remained warm, reverent, alive. Luis, now in his early 40s, kept the place much as it had always been. The black box remained on its pedestal, untouched except by those who truly needed it. The shelves now overflowed with journals, anonymous letters, found objects. Each carried a moment, each a weight someone once tried to bury. One Tuesday afternoon, a young woman entered. Her name was Ivy. She was new to the city, recently orphaned, carrying a leather-bound journal she hadn't dared open since her father's funeral. She sat by the window for hours without speaking, watching the light move across the wood. Luis didn't ask why she came. Instead, he offered her a cup of tea and a place by the shelf where people left stories. That night, after everyone had left, Ivy approached the box. She didn't open it. She placed the journal beside it along with a single note. He said the best parts of him were the parts he never said aloud. I believe him now. Weeks passed. Ivy returned daily. She began writing again, this time not to understand the pain, but to give it shape, to let it breathe. Eventually, she offered to help keep the room. She learned how to dust the fragile pages, how to listen without interrupting, how to sit in silence without fearing its weight. And then one day she asked, "Luis, who taught you to listen like that?" He didn't answer right away. He simply reached for the small notebook Eli had left him, now protected behind glass. Luis opened to a page and read aloud. "Presence is the only language that never lies. It asks for nothing, and somehow it gives everything." Ivy copied the passage in her own handwriting and taped it behind the front desk. Visitors began asking about it. Some wrote it down. Others simply stood in front of it for a long time, saying nothing, as if letting it sink into their bones. The reading room began to appear in local stories. A journalist described it as a sanctuary for the unheard. A professor brought students to study the architecture of non-verbal memory. A mother brought her son after the loss of his best friend, just to let him see how grief can be held gently without being forced to move on. Luis never positioned himself as founder. He always said the room belonged to a man who noticed another. Man trying to throw away something he shouldn't, and when people pressed for details, he would smile and say, the details weren't the point, the noticing was. The city changed around the room. New buildings, new technologies, louder streets, but the room kept its soft light, its warm wood, its constant invitation. Bring what you thought no one would care about. Let it rest, let it speak. And so the legacy continued, not in plaques, not in books, but in a slow, steady movement of quiet hands reaching toward forgotten stories. The reading room by now had become less of a place and more of a presence. People who visited often described it afterward in ways they couldn't quite explain, not as a location, but as a feeling. A hush that lingered even after they stepped outside. A stillness that settled behind their ribs, a memory not of what they read or saw, but of how they were seen. Luis noticed it too, how the room had become larger without expanding, how even silence, when held well, could be heard by the soul. He had grown older without really aging, his hair now grayed at the sides, his hands slower in movement. But his eyes still carried the same light that Eli once passed to him, the same unspoken fire Warren once kindled in Eli. The line continued, not by blood, not by name, but by witness. One late autumn afternoon, as golden leaves scraped along the sidewalk, Luis sat alone in the room after closing. A journal had just been left that day by a man who didn't give his name. It was wrapped in a cloth and bound with twine. Luis opened it slowly. Each page was covered in writing, not polished, not structured, just raw, unfiltered life. Anger, joy, shame, wonder. About halfway through, one line caught him. The people who saved me never knew I was drowning. Luis closed the book gently. Then he stood, lit the small candle by the black box, and for the first time in years, spoke aloud to the empty room. "Warren," he said, "you didn't know you were building this, did you?" He waited, not for a reply, but to honor the question. Then he continued, "You left a kite in the trash, a note with 4 words, a photograph of a boy." He paused, his voice quieter, and somehow from that grew all of this. The wind outside picked up, and the window pane trembled. Luis crossed the room and opened the drawer where Eli's notebook was kept. It had not been touched for some time. He removed it and placed it beside the journal just received. Old and new, grief and gratitude. He pulled out a pen and added one more line to Eli's final page. "Legacy isn't what we leave, it's what we make possible." Later that night, Avi returned. She had forgotten her scarf. She found Luis asleep in the chair near the window, the journal still open on his lap. She didn't wake him. Instead, she wrapped the scarf around her shoulders and sat nearby. She looked at the candle, still burning, and for a moment, she closed her eyes. She remembered her father's laughter, the sound of old records spinning in the house. The way he once whispered, "Even if you lose me, don't lose the story." Ivy stood, crossed to the black box, and added a photo. Her father smiling in a garden, holding a cup of tea. No caption. No name, only memory. And as she stepped back, she noticed the wind had shifted. The curtain near the window moved slightly. She didn't question it. She just whispered, "Thank you," not knowing exactly who she was thanking, only that someone, somewhere, had once chosen to keep what others might have thrown away. Time, eventually, touches everything. The reading room did not last forever, at least not in the way buildings do. Years later, city developers approached the area with new plans: housing, transport, progress. Luis had known this would come. He didn't resist it. He only asked for one thing: to let me close it myself. And so, one Sunday morning, with Ivy beside him and a few familiar faces scattered throughout the room, he opened the door one last time. The air was filled not with sadness, but with reverence, like the final breath of a song that had meant something. There was no ceremony, just moments. A girl who had once brought her grandfather's compass now touched it one last time on the shelf. A man whose wife had passed 6 winters earlier placed a feather beside the black box. A teacher brought a group of students who stood in respectful silence, notebooks in hand, unsure why their eyes stung. Luis stood near the center of the room. He wore a brown cardigan, a wool scarf Eli had once given him. In his hands, he held the box, still black, still whole. He didn't open it. He simply looked around, eyes resting on each person, each object, each light beam falling across. "Worn floorboards. You never needed this place," he said softly. "You needed what it reminded you of." He turned to Ivy and handed her the key. "Keep it," he said. Then, with steady steps, he left the building. No glance back. Outside, the city moved as it always had. People hurried, cars passed, dogs barked. But in Luis's silence, there was no rush. He walked to the hill, the one where Eli had flown the kite, where Warren had sat beneath the windbreak. He knelt, opened the box for the final time, and laid out each item as if returning them to the earth. The note, the photo, the pawn, the drawing, the journal, the kite, and last of all, a single blank piece of paper. He folded it slowly into a new kite. It wasn't perfect. The folds were uneven, the frame bent, but it didn't matter, because legacy, he had come to understand, isn't in perfection, it's in persistence. He stood, lifted the new kite, and waited. The wind arrived, not strong but steady. Enough, he let go. The kite rose, not fast, not high, but it rose. Luis watched until it was no longer a shape, but just a part of the sky. Then he sat on the grass, closed the box, and whispered, "Someone will find you again." Far below, the city continued. Children laughed, doors opened, phones rang. But on that hill, something eternal had been passed. Not shouted, not shown, just handed on. And so the story ended where all quiet stories do. Not with a final word, but with a presence that remains. Elsewhere, the story kept living. Not in grand monuments, but in small gestures scattered across the map like quiet echoes. In a coastal town, an elderly man sat on a bench each morning with a thermos of coffee and an empty cup beside him. He didn't wait for anyone. He just believed someone might need a seat. In a village school, a teacher began every week by letting her students place one object on a table, a found stone, a ribbon, a torn drawing, and told them, "Everything has a story, even if you haven't told it yet." In a library in another state, tucked between shelves on the second floor, a reader found a note inside a book of poems. "You're not lost. You're just not fully remembered yet." No one signed it, but people began leaving their own notes. Within months, the book was filled with them. Margins inked with sorrows, hopes, tiny flashes of joy. None of these people knew Warren. Fewer still had heard of Eli, but the thread had reached them. In a hospital, a nurse left a paper kite on the windowsill of a patient who had stopped speaking. 3 days later, the patient whispered a name no one had heard before. It was his. Brothers, in a neighborhood park, a boy tied string between trees and hung photographs of strangers, found anonymous, blurred, with the sign, "If you see someone you know, tell them you remember." At a rest stop in the middle of nowhere, someone had built a shelf inside the bathroom wall. On it were trinkets, all left by travelers. A button, a receipt, a photo of a child and a dog. Above it, written in faded ink, "Leave something you thought had no place." And perhaps most beautifully, in a quiet town in Nebraska, someone mailed an envelope to a small community center. Inside was a yellowed note with 4 simple words. Find the boy again. No return address, no explanation. Just a moment returning. Home. These were not acts of worship. They were ripples, whispers, continuations, proof that what had begun between 2 boys on a dirt road, one with glasses, the other holding a kite, had not been forgotten. It had not even ended. It had simply changed hands. And so the world moved on, never fully knowing it had been softened, but those who felt it, they carried it. And in quiet moments, just before dawn, just after loss, in the breath between words, they passed it on again. It's easy to forget the things that don't make noise, easy to overlook what doesn't announce itself, a look, a folded paper, a moment when someone hesitates but chooses to stay. But the truth is, the world is held together by these things. The unseen hands, the unspoken forgiveness, the memory that slips into a stranger's gesture without explanation. Warren Buffett once made the world listen through numbers. But in the end, it wasn't the numbers that lasted. It was the silence, the spaces between. It was a note thrown away, found by a man who swept floors with reverence. It was the act of keeping something others had abandoned, and in that, something remarkable happened, something few will ever fully name. One man's quiet regret became another man's sacred task, and that task became a path, not a loud one, but one made of a child remembering the warmth of a stranger's smile, a nurse choosing to listen instead of speak, a room filled with forgotten objects that suddenly mattered again. And when people ask, as they sometimes do, what does it mean to leave a legacy? Perhaps the answer is not in what we achieve, but in what we choose to carry, and in what we give others permission to carry after us. Final scene, a new beginning years from now. In a city far from Omaha, a young woman walks into a small bookstore. She's lost, not in direction, but in meaning. She browses without intention until she finds a curious object near the back, a folded paper kite, sealed in a clear frame, with a card that reads, "Legacy is not what we leave, it's what we notice." She doesn't buy it. She doesn't need. But something in her changes. That night, she writes a letter to someone she hasn't spoken to in years. She doesn't explain why, only that she needed to say, "I remember you." The story of Warren Buffett and the janitor who found a note in his trash was never told on the news, but it lives, not in headlines, in habits, in pauses, in the gentle things that stay. Because sometimes, what the world needs most is not more information, not more voices, but one more presence that doesn't speak loudly, yet says everything. Long after the reading room was gone, the building that took its place had no idea what rested beneath its floor. The construction team that arrived found nothing unusual. No inscriptions, no messages, no artifacts. Only a patch of earth that seemed, for some reason, warmer than the rest. No one thought much of it, but months later, a security guard working the night shift in the new office complex began noticing small things. A folded note left in the elevator, a pawn piece tucked between tiles, a paper kite taped inside a maintenance closet. At first, he dismissed it. Then, one evening, he opened the supply cabinet and found a box, black, wooden, plain. Inside, blank sheets of paper and a card that read, "Sometimes what you're meant to carry finds you." The guard, named Ramon, had never believed in signs. He worked quietly, kept his life simple, but that night he wrote something on one of the pages. Not much, just a sentence he'd never said aloud. "I'm tired of pretending. I'm fine." He folded the paper and placed it back in the box. The next night there were 2 pages, a second handwriting. He never saw who else was using it, but within weeks it became a ritual. He would write, someone would reply, neither would sign, neither would explain. It became a form of presence, no advice, no judgment, only listening, only space. And that was enough. Elsewhere, Ivy, now older, still quiet, began a practice of her own. She took long train rides with no destination, simply to sit beside strangers and ask a single question. What's something you've never said out loud? She never recorded the answers. She just held them. Sometimes they were stories. Sometimes they were silences that trembled before becoming words. Each time, she smiled softly and said, "Thank you for trusting me with that." One day, a young woman asked her, "Why do you do this?" Ivy looked out the window, thinking of a room with soft light, a man who never asked questions but made you feel safe enough to answer anyway. Because someone once held mine. A boy in Tokyo tied messages to strings between buildings. A woman in Chile left postcards with handwritten lines in taxi seats. A teacher in Lagos began each class by asking students to name one thing that mattered to them, that others wouldn't. Notice, the thread stretched across oceans, borders, generations, and not once did it need to say the word legacy, because what mattered had already entered the world through presence, carried forward by those who had felt seen, and in a world obsessed. With echo, it was the stillness that lingered. There is a tree that grows behind the foundation where the reading room once stood. No one planted it, at least not in the way trees are usually planted. It started as a sprout, unexpected, thin, and unremarkable. Some assumed it came from a seed dropped by a bird. Others said it had always been there, just hidden beneath the concrete, but over the years, it grew tall, strong, rooted. Every spring, it bloomed early, not brightly, but softly. Petals the color of quiet dawns. Children played beneath it. Workers ate lunch under its shade, and once someone carved a small kite into its bark, not for decoration. For memory, a city changes, but memory finds ways to remain. In a bench nearby, someone once left a notebook with a ribbon around it. It contained no story, only a question on the cover. Who did you become? Because someone saw you. People began writing their answers. Some were short, a teacher, a father who stayed, alive. Some were pages long, but all of them carried the same pulse, that somewhere along the way they had been noticed, held, remembered. And though none of them knew Warren Buffett, they had all been changed by a note he almost threw away. Somewhere, in a quiet house with thin curtains and warm wooden floors, an old man sits at a window. He watches a girl flying a kite in the park across the street. The kite isn't fancy. It's made of old paper, colored with markers, a little crooked, but it catches the wind and it rises. The old man smiles, not because he understands it, but because he recognizes something in it. He doesn't know why it moves him, only that it does. He sits a little straighter, takes a deeper breath, and whispers into the empty room, "Thank you." Because sometimes the most enduring legacies are not the ones we build, but the ones we quietly pass on, in a glance, in a gesture, in a note meant to be thrown away but found just in time. There are places where stories choose to stay, not in books, not even in memory, but in air, in wood, in the way a space holds silence long after the people have gone. In one such place, a library with creaking floors and high windows, there sits a shelf without labels. Above it, a handwritten sign, "Objects that once mattered." On the shelf, a matchbox filled with sand, a photo of two boys in a treehouse, a paper clip bent into a heart, a napkin with a smudge that looks like wings, a folded yellow note unreadable from years of being touched. Visitors pass the shelf. Some stop, some add their own. A bus ticket, a key, a coin, No one explains why, but the shelf keeps growing, and sometimes when the light hits just right in the early afternoon, it feels as if the shelf is breathing, not with lungs, but with memory. A continent away, on the side of a mountain trail, a small sign is nailed to a tree. You are not invisible, it's weathered, almost illegible, but every week someone adds a stone at its base. The pile grows. No names, just presence. And once a year, in a small school in the countryside, a teacher tells her students the story of a janitor who found a note. She never says who wrote it, only what it said. Find the boy again. Then she asks them to write their own 4 words. The students fold them, place them in a jar. The jar stays in the center of the classroom all year. At the end of the year, the students take their papers home. They don't open them. Not yet. The point isn't the words. It's the act of choosing to hold something quietly until it's needed. And so, the story of Warren Buffett, not the billionaire, but the man who once lost a friend and carried the silence for a lifetime, continues, not through monuments, not through wealth, but through paper kites and boxes left in dark corners, through people who sweep quietly, who write letters they'll never send, who ask strangers how they're really doing and wait for the answer. Because in the end, this story isn't just about Warren or Eli or Louise or Ivy. It's about what happens when someone notices and chooses to stay. Many years later, in a small, almost forgotten attic above a used bookstore in Omaha, a boy discovered an old cardboard box. He'd been helping the shop's elderly owner, Mr. Reeves, clean out storage. Dusty corners, unsorted stacks, abandoned. Donations. The box was unmarked, sealed with thin twine, and heavier than it looked. Inside, folded with care, was a single sheet of aged newspaper, wrapped around something delicate. He peeled it back slowly. A paper kite, faded, torn at one edge. But intact, there was no string, no name, only a pencil mark near the tail, nearly rubbed away. B.H. The boy didn't understand it. He only felt that it mattered. That night, he brought it home and placed it above his bed. He didn't tell his parents. He didn't need to. He only knew it made him feel calm, like someone before him had once tried to fly, and now it was his turn. Across town, the reading room spirit had found its way into a modest community space run by volunteers. No black box, no official rituals, just a table where people left things, a cracked watch, a ribbon, a note with a single word, stay. One afternoon, a woman came in, sat quietly, and after 30 minutes, she pulled out a piece of paper and wrote, "He taught me to listen to what's missing." She folded it, placed it inside a worn book of essays, and left without saying anything. Later that evening, a boy found it while browsing. He didn't know who had written it, but it felt like it was meant for him. In a nursing home in Lincoln, a retired school librarian named Mara spent her afternoons telling stories no one had asked for. She didn't read from books. She just remembered out loud. Warren, Eli, Louise, Ivy, the room, the box, the kite. No one knew if the details were true, but the way she spoke made people believe. One nurse, moved by her voice, began writing again. A man who hadn't spoken in weeks asked her to repeat the part about the chess game. Another, nearing his last days, asked for a paper kite to be hung near his bed, and so, without trying, Mara became the final keeper of a story that was never hers. Not to own, but to pass on. Years from now, the paper will dissolve. The kite will vanish. Even the black box will be forgotten in the layers of time. But somewhere, always, a moment will come when someone sees what others overlook. A janitor's hand pausing over a trash can. A child folding a piece of paper with care. A stranger staying to listen a moment longer than they needed to. And in that moment, without knowing how or why, the story will continue. Not because it's remembered, but because it was once carried with love. And perhaps that is enough. If this story touched your heart in a quiet, lasting way, like this video and subscribe to Panorama Legacy. Every click helps share messages that don't shout, but stay. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and which moment in Warren's journey moved you the most. And if you're ready for another story, one that inspires without speaking loudly, that transforms without needing the spotlight, click on the next video on your screen, because sometimes what the world needs most is just one more silent presence.